Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are diving into the life and career of Chuck Berry, who is one of the most pivotal characters in American music. So, stick around. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time of year again. August 22nd, 3rd, and 4th, we are doing the second annual Kennedy Meadows Music Festival up at Kennedy Meadows here. And tickets are available at KennedyMeadowsMusicFest.com, and at checkout, use code GeorgeCroftKM, capital G, capital C, and get you some tickets here. It's great. So I think the cabins are sold out, but there's still room for trailer spaces. There's first come, first served tent camping. The lineup this year for Kennedy's is going to be awesome. We've got Dallas Burrow is coming back. Chad Bushnell's coming back. Dave Stamey's coming back. Trinity Seeley's coming back. Ben Haggard is headlining. And so it's going to be just an awesome show. I can't tell you how excited I am. I'll be there all weekend long. I'll be emceeing the whole thing and playing on Saturday. So come on out and see us here. So get your tickets while you can. All right, but first, I've got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. We'll be into August 1st. I'll be at Diamond Jim's in Mewook. And then August 2nd, I'll be at the Sonora Tap Room in downtown Sonora. August 10th, I'll be at Gaslight Co. in downtown Folsom. August 14th, I'll be at Tano's in Orangevale. And then we've got the Kennedy Meadows Music Festival the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th of August. So come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler&Co_marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit TylerandCoFilms.com for all your photography needs. That's TylerandCoFilms.com. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some big news coming up here. So I have started an Indiegogo campaign to produce and launch my next single called To Be Enough. And I'm very passionate about this project. It's one of my favorite songs I've ever written. And I'm going to give it 100% effort here to get this thing professionally done, released, and promoted across all the different social media platforms and everything else. Kind of put all my eggs in this basket for now and see how far I can take it. But for that to work, I need public support, and that can be found on my Indiegogo page, which can be found on my Linktree, which is through either my TikTok or Instagram account. If you go to my links, my Indiegogo campaign is the top one, and I would love and appreciate any support that you guys feel like giving, and we're going to try to make a real go of this thing. So please, if you don't mind, check that out, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry is, as far as his role in American music goes, it's all an outgrowth of Chuck Berry after the 1950s. He really, there is music before Chuck Berry, and everything else is, you can see his fingerprints across all genres, and especially as rock and roll gets going here, none of our music would be the same without this guy. And so, he's born in 1926, and Chuck Berry's also he's a good study on American culture at the time because of where he starts and where he ends up. He kind of sees a real evolution in the kind of public morality and kind of American culture, because obviously he's born into the Jim Crow era. And it is rough initially. I mean, later he tells a story about, like, him and his dad literally get turned away from a theater that they were going to go see a show, and just the lady at the ticket office says, we don't let you get kinds of people in here, and like turns him and his dad away when he was like 11 years old or something, which, was par for the course at the time, unfortunately. So, but anyway, he has a similar childhood to some of our other artists, where he grows up singing in church. He starts kind of messing with guitar, and he starts to gain a reputation as a musically talented dude really early on. And so that's like all through the 30s, he's, singing in church and kind of just being a kid. And then in 1941, it's what they call his first stage debut. He's playing at his high school. And he was a blues artist. I mean, that at the time, that was what he had to go on. Like, he grew up singing gospel and the blues. And but he pretty quickly puts his own flavor on stuff. And most of rock and roll is basically just the blues sped up, is what it is. And but anyway, and because Chuck Berry sped it up, it didn't happen on its own. So he's, kind of getting through his high school years here. When he's 17 years old, he has his first run-ins with the law. Now, Chuck Berry is another one of these characters that, like, if you look at his whole story, it's a little conflicting, because the bad things that happen to him are equally attributed to Chuck Berry's bad decision-making and the American criminal justice system doing its best to just squash this guy because he's black. Like, that's, both of those things are true. He gets himself in trouble with bad decisions, and the system just gets after him and really just throws the book at him on a few different occasions here. But the first notable one here is when he's 17, him and I think 3 friends decide that they're going to Los Angeles on a road trip. And they don't make it very far. They run out of money, and they rob 3 gas stations. And their car breaks down, and like there's this weird interaction where like their car breaks down. Some guy pulls up to help. There's some kind of confrontation there. That guy runs away, leaving his car behind. And Chuck Berry and his friends take that guy's car, and they're pushing their car with it. So they're going down the highway, one car pushing the other, trying to get to the next spot, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what the long-term plan was there. Regardless, they're stopped by the police and arrested. And later convicted. And, so Chuck ends up in what they called a reform school. It was basically juvenile detention. So that's his first kind of mark. And to the point where it was enough of a deal that when he meets his wife here shortly after, that's like a thing that even his community is like, oh, well, he's been in reform school. And that's, he had this, he was a con sort of, like that was an ex-con at the time. But, so that's his first run-in with the law. And he uses that time, like as he will in future, incarcerations. He does pour himself into his music and kind of, he's just practicing all the time, trying to, get himself to pass the time here. But, anyway, so that was in Missouri that he went to the reform school. So when he gets out, during that time, he actually formed a band. So he's not just practicing, he forms a quartet, and they're, performing in and out front of this reform school. And he gets out on his 21st birthday. And I don't know if that was just because that's when the sentence ran out, or if him turning 21 had an effect on his ability to be at that reform school. I don't fully understand, but he's released on his 21st birthday. And he gets out, and he meets his wife soon after here. And they seem to have pretty early. So this is where like we already start to see a split in his character, where like on the one hand, he meets his wife, Themeta is her name, and he
they stay married for the rest of his life. Like he's, Chuck Berry, the family man, and Chuck Berry, the rock star guy that's coming. But as far as his family goes, his wife and his kids describe him as this. He was Mr. Family Man. He loved his kids. He loved his wife. He was very involved, when he's around, not on the road. But so that starts here. And she tells the story of them meeting as this very like love at first sight, very sweet, very romantic. They're kind of inseparable pretty quickly after meeting. And anyway, and she encourages his musical inclinations. And he's, and then he gets back into playing in church. So he's going to church with Themeta, and he's starting to flex his guitar muscles here. And that's, through the rest of the 40s and the 50s. And so in 1952, he meets and joins the band with Johnny Johnson, who, that was part of a trio. It was, the Johnny Johnson trio. And this is where the light really starts to shine on him, because now he joins this trio as a band member, and pretty quickly he's the front man, because he's right off the bat recognized as a talented songwriter and a talented guitar player. And so after a while, they actually changed the name of that trio to the Chuck Berry Trio. And it sounds like Johnny Johnson didn't have an issue with that. It sounds like he was a pretty practical dude, and he kind of understood that, like, okay, we're selling tickets because Chuck Berry's there, and we're, the music's pretty much his now, and like he's the big personality in the group, so he's totally okay with this name switch for the group. And that's 1952. Now 1955 is when he goes to Chicago, and his big break is coming shortly hereafter, because he meets Muddy Waters, who's another blues icon, and he's the one. So Muddy Waters introduces Chuck Berry to Chess Records, like to the executives at Chess Records, and they get a record deal. And this is where he releases Maybellene, which is, it sounds like he didn't write this song. So it was, originally it was called Ida Red, and then it was Ida May, and then they land on Maybellene. So I think the original song was called Ida Red, I think. It was a Bob Wills song. But anyway, Chuck Berry puts his stamp on it, changes the words a little bit, and now it's Maybellene. And that's, it. So that was his first number one on the R&B charts in 1955. It was number one on the R&B charts for 11 weeks, and it was number 5 on the pop charts. So the curve of his career success hits a real steep climb here in 1955, 56. Because in 56, he releases Roll Over Beethoven, which is, to this day, one of his most iconic songs. So, and it's, and it does really well, and he's a star now, is kind of how this is going. And because it's not just like we've talked about other artists, like in country music and everything else, where like their star takes off and they're kind of recognized within their genre as doing really well. Chuck Berry is rewriting the rules as far as R&B and the blues go. Like this is the birth of rock and roll, is Chuck Berry's takeoff, because nobody had heard music like this before now. This is, because you got to remember, this is like, he's been at this since 1953. So the people that are hearing this are people like Elvis Presley, who is also coming up around the same time. Like, because you remember, Elvis Presley walked in to his record label in 1953. So this is, and basically, and I think Elvis kind of acknowledged this, and most people do at this point, Elvis he kind of adopted Chuck Berry's style. And, he was obviously like more, well, I guess you could say he was more animated on stage. I mean, not really, because Chuck Berry's doing the duck walk and he's jumping around and dancing on stage and stuff. But Elvis, doing his hip shaking thing. The main difference is that Elvis was white and he was an easier sell to the, the radio world. But, that being said, Chuck Berry kicks it off. And so in 1955, Maybellene goes, Roll Over Beethoven is 56. 57, He's on tour with the Everly Brothers and Buddy Holly, who we did an episode on. And, but this is where he's like I said, he's building this foundation for the reputation that he gains. And, 1959, he releases Sweet Little 16. And I don't know if I mentioned this in the Brian Wilson episode, but he actually, like, I think it was Sweet Little 16. The Beach Boys basically just take that music and put different words on it. And, you know, I think Barry actually sues him over it, and that's how he gets his writing credit with the Beach Boys. It wasn't like, oh, hey, we always acknowledged that this was Chuck Berry's stuff. Brian Wilson kind of just stole it and then got sued later, and now Chuck Berry gets a writing credit. For I think it was Surfin' in the USA. That was the Beach Boys song. But, okay, so here comes trouble, because all of his, and by the way, while he's doing this, he's running into a lot where, like, Chuck Berry's getting turned away from his own shows because the people at the door didn't realize he was black before he got there. So he would show up to play, and the security's like, no, we don't let you in. Like, that's, you know, this show isn't for you kind of people. And they would turn Chuck Berry away from his own gigs, and then, you know, then the drama that would ensue. But, so you can imagine, like, his radio popularity is screaming through the culture faster than the in-person crowd is realizing that this is a black artist and that they might have an issue with it. So, like, and I think that's a real cultural moment in America, because the teenage crowd, the first thing they know is, oh, I love Chuck Berry music. That's their first impression of Chuck Berry, hearing him on the radio. And then even the ones that might have had an issue with him being black, that's the second thing they learn about him, instead of, you know, what I would imagine is normal at the time. Their first bit of information is the race of the person, and then they build their opinion from there. Not here. They build their opinion first off of his music, and then that really, Chuck Berry's uphill battle in American culture is really helped by that. And that's a real, you know, and that obviously has effects rippling out from him on the American consciousness. Like, I would bet that the civil rights movement of the 60s, a lot of those people that were willing to help and be a part of that opinion is built on their love of music and Chuck Berry's impact. So I would, you know, it'd be an interesting thing to, like, have a time machine and go back and see how the civil rights movement goes without Chuck Berry's influence. And I tend to think that it, you know, it might not have gone as well without people like this. And so, but, and so the power structures in America that existed at the time were aware of this and did not like it. It was the man did not like that Chuck Berry was getting all this attention and, you know, and having the effect on public opinion that he was. This is where he makes a mistake here that, and it's tough for me to, like, look back at some of these things with a modern lens, because as you might remember from our Jerry Lee Lewis episode, Jerry Lee Lewis destroys his career in part because he marries his 13-year-old cousin, right? And like I said, in that episode, I talked about how, like, that was enough to sink his career, and the people around him made excuses about how it was different, you know, different times, people had different proclivities. At first, my impulse is like, no, like, that wouldn't be okay then. It's not okay now. Like, that's pretty cut and dry. But then you start looking at all these other artists, and that stands in my mind. Definitely not okay. It is also true, though, that Chuck Berry's troubles here. So what happens is in 1959, he meets a girl in New Mexico. And she's a 14-year-old Apache girl that he meets. She's working at a club. Now, this gets a little complicated because, like, by the time Chuck Berry meets her, she'd already been to jail for prostitution, which is wild on its own account. But Chuck Berry meets this girl. They develop a relationship outside of his marriage, which, and like I said, the split between, like, Family Man and Rockstar Man, Chuck Berry being married did not slow him down at all. He still, like, he had a thing for the ladies, and his wife knew it. And she just kind of, his wife even talks about, like, no, like, well, what was on the road, that was a different side of Chuck. And he was the family man when he was home, and what happens on the road happens on the road kind of thing. But anyway, he gets involved with this 14-year-old Apache girl and moves her to, I think, St. Louis, where he had a club at the time. And the actual timeline of how that went is a little unclear. He made arrangements for her to go to his club and to get hired as a waitress. And that in itself is problematic. But anyway, so she goes. And within not that long, I think, like, just looking at the dates, I think it's within like a month or two that she ends up getting fired from Chuck's club. Now, I don't exactly know the circumstances that led up to that, but so she's, 14 or 15 at the time. She gets fired, and she moves across the street and starts, engaging in prostitution again. And so she gets picked up by the police. And so Chuck Berry, it's not like, you didn't have the Jerry Lee Lewis moment where it's like there's Jerry and his 13-year-old cousin and they're together and we all know what's going on here and this is just nuts. It was kind of like he kept it under wraps. She gets fired, just like walks across the street and goes back to, prostitution. She gets picked up by the cops and she just tells them all about how Chuck Berry brought her to town. That is all the cops needed to hear, because he gets rung up on the Mann Act. Now, the Mann Act has been in the news recently. I don't know if anybody, noticed. But basically, the Mann Act was, I think, it was from 1910, and I think it was originally called, like, the White Slave Trafficking Act or something. Yeah. So they wrote it, like, it's weird, because nowadays, for example, the Mann Act is the reason that Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison. They got her for transporting minors across state lines for, sex work. But the reason they wrote the Mann Act was because of Jack Johnson, who was a boxer in the early 1900s. I think it was 1910 that they wrote the act. This is kind of like Jack Johnson in his heyday. And what happened is Jack Johnson had a 19-year-old white girlfriend that he was bringing with him to all of his fights, and the powers that be just could not have that. I mean, and Jack Johnson was... The Jack Johnson story is not music, but it's worth a dive if you are interested in this kind of part of history. Because Jack Johnson was just this monster of a dude traveling the country, beating the snot out of white dudes with his young white girlfriend in tow. And like I said, the power structures could not handle that. So the Mann Act gets written and it gets applied against Jack Johnson. Very similarly, they apply it to Chuck Berry, with the obvious difference being that this girl was 14. And I would have a problem with that now. Like, if you rang up some other, like, if there was another artist, like, R. Kelly also got rung up on the Mann Act. I don't have a problem with that at all. Like, not a cultural thing. Like, just the Mann Act as it is applied today, I don't have that much of a problem with it. It had very problematic beginnings. And so so Chuck Berry gets arrested and charged with Mann Act violations. Now, whether or not that would, however you feel about that today, the case goes horribly for Chuck Berry, to the point where the judge in the case is slinging around racial slurs during the trial, and Chuck gets sentenced to like 5 years in prison or something. Rightly so, his lawyers appeal the case because of the judge's prejudices, and that appeal is accepted, and that conviction is thrown out. So, but he's quickly recharged, retried, and then convicted again. But this time he gets sentenced to only 3 years in prison. But there was that, so it kind of gives you a flavor of the system that he was in. It was like, it was not an equal application of justice here. They really did throw the book at him, and the judge was a racist to begin with. So, like, that's the culture that we're zooming in on here. And like I said, both things are true when you hear people say, oh, they just threw the book at Chuck Berry and it was all because of racism and everything else. That's half true. The other half that's true is he brought a 14-year-old Apache girl to, his club. Like, that's not okay. But anyway, the problem is that at the same time, if you look at his same, like, kind of era of people, this is happening around the same time as Jerry Lee Lewis. And Elvis. Elvis had a 14-year-old girlfriend, his wife, that he later married. She was 14, and I think he was 24 or something when they met. So Elvis had a similar thing going on. Jerry Lee Lewis had a similar thing going on. Chuck Berry had a similar thing going on. But only Chuck Berry goes to prison. That's not great. But anyway, so he does. He ends up serving 20 months in prison for this Mann Act violation. Now, that really was like I said, he's already a cultural icon. Like, this is, it wasn't like he was an unknown. He's a star, and he's in prison. And, but he does, like I said, he does same thing he did before, where he throws himself into his music, and he's kind of a upstanding citizen of the prison community here. I think he gets his GED at the time, and he doesn't just waste away in prison here. He does spend some time working on his craft and kind of education, that kind of thing. And but anyway, so he gets out in 1970, and he signs with Mercury Records. Let me make sure I get that right. No, sorry, 1963. Jeez, okay, I skipped a couple of years here. So he went to prison for 20 months, beginning of 1962 to the end of 1963. And then, so he gets out and he records No Particular Place to Go, which is also a hit. So it really, like, oddly enough, this 20-year prison sentence doesn't damper his career very much. I mean, he gets out and gets back to it pretty quick here. And this is right when the British invasion is happening. So, like, Chuck Berry comes out of prison right as the Beatles are, like, making their entrance and the Rolling Stones are taking off. And it's kind of a real kind of swirling of events in the rock and roll timeline here is right when Chuck Berry gets out of prison. And so he does No Particular Place to Go. And then 1966, he gets on with Mercury Records. Now, he doesn't have any notable singles coming out during this time with Mercury. And I'm not exactly clear on the reasons behind that. Except for, let's see, because he returns to Chess Records. Chess Records is the record label that that Muddy Waters had hooked him up with. And so he leaves Mercury, goes back to Chess, and then he starts hitting number ones again. But what's funny is that his next number one, his only number one song, at least on the pop charts, is Ding-a-Ling, which he wrote as a throwaway, funny, just addition to a record he was working on. He did not, like, if you had all of his records laid out in front of him and asked him to pick which one's going to be your number one, he would not have picked that one. He, like I said, he wrote it as a joke. But culture picked it up, and it goes number one for him. So, okay, a win is a win. And and then he proceeds, for the rest of the 70s here, he's kind of in another heyday where he's traveling around playing all the time. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones love him, so he's playing with them all the time. He develops a friendship with Keith Richards, who there's a bunch of hilarious footage of Chuck Berry and Keith Richards where, like, Keith Richards will tell you that Chuck Berry is his musical hero, he loved Chuck Berry and, like, that influenced his guitar playing, greatly. And so he gets to meet Chuck Berry, and they start kind of hanging out, and they're playing together, and they're, and there's this one video in particular where it's like Chuck is really just getting after Keith Richards about, like, no, you play it like this, not like that. And, like, to the untrained ear, they're playing the same thing back and forth to each other, but Chuck just won't drop it, and he just keeps after Keith Richards to play it this specific way. So he does. Chuck goes, okay, perfect, and then turns back to what he's doing, and you see Keith look off camera just like okay, and because he's kind of giving him guff back and forth, like, which is funny. He's just, like, arguing with his hero about how to play a song that Chuck wrote. But it kind of gives you a. It is also what's funny about that video is that Chuck Berry is speaking in the third person, which is just another funny wrinkle where it's just like, oh, this is the way Chuck Berry plays it. This is a Chuck Berry song, and I'm going to show you how Chuck Berry does it. And it's just a funny thing to watch and like kind of see where his head was at the time. And that's also the period of time where one of my favorite Chuck Berry videos on the internet is he's playing with John Lennon. And they were on a TV show that they were on for like a week or something. And they're playing, I think it's Johnny B. Goode they're playing, yeah. And Yoko Ono is backstage, and she's just shrieking, and she's just standing like shoulders down, mic in the middle, and she just like starts screaming into the mic. And you see Chuck is in the mic like playing with John. They're both singing in the same microphone, and you see his eyebrows come up, and he just kind of looks over like horrified at whatever is happening behind him. And you just you see his professionalism because he keeps it together and they keep, playing the song. But it's just this hilarious eyebrow raise of like, what the hell is happening behind me? And so he looks over, and thank God the sound guys kind of were on the same page, and they just unplug Yoko's mic. So for the rest of that video, you see, John and Chuck finish the song, and you just see Yoko in the background, still very clearly screaming into her microphone. She just can't tell that it's been unplugged. But that was, at the time, it would appear that John Lennon had a real blind spot for Yoko Ono and couldn't tell her, hey, stop. He just let her keep going, which caused all of its own problems in the Beatles, history. That Yoko Ono was a very pivotal character in that story, and not for great reasons. But anyway, like I said, that's just one of my favorite Chuck Berry moments, is him just side-eyeing Yoko Ono, like, what are you doing? What are we doing here? And but anyway, so also during this time that he's experienced all of this success and the wave of popularity, he also run into some problems with the IRS, very similarly to Jerry Lee Lewis. Now, like I said, both guys have a very similar... Honestly, Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee have a lot of similarities across the board. Like I said, their troubles with the underage girl thing, their styles on stage were very similar. Apparently, their propensity to pay their taxes on time, also very similar, because, like Jerry Lee Lewis gets in trouble with the IRS, but he ends up just like owing him a bunch of money. It was like, at first they judged that he owed him $3 million or something, but then his lawyers do their thing and he ends up paying like $600,000 or something. That's Jerry Lee. Chuck Berry goes to prison. Like So again, we just see both things are problematic. Both things deserve a certain level of, condemnation from the public, but only one of these guys goes to jail. And what's what's ironic about that is 3 days before Chuck goes to jail, he's performing at the White House. He's made the absolute height of his musical, I don't know if that's the absolute height, but a very significant event in his musical career, playing for the president at the White House. 3 days later, he's in prison for tax evasion. And that was a shorter stint, but still, again, like I said, just an unfortunate reflection of the American criminal justice system at the time. And let's see here. So while he's in prison that time, so the first time he got his GED or whatever, second time he gets to work writing his autobiography. And so that's 1979. And what's funny is that I want to say it was less than 4 months. It was so he goes to prison for 4 months. What's funny about it is that his team is able to release music while he's gone, so a lot of the public doesn't even realize that he's in jail. He's still releasing music, he's still on the radio, he's just not performing for 4 months. He's tucked away in prison writing his book. Which a 4-month window of not being around in the music business is, to the audience, it's a relative blip. You can get through that without people noticing. But anyway, so he goes to prison for tax evasion, and but he comes out, swinging. He's back to performing, in the into the 80s here. So there's also, I didn't write it here on my timeline, but one of the things Chuck did with his money is he got into real estate really early. Like, he was buying houses left and right. So he'd built himself a little bit of a real estate empire. And he buys he called it Berry Park, which is his estate that he kind of built this music venue on his property. And in the beginning anyway, it was a giant success. I mean, his kids talk about how, like, at first it was like they just had like tractors and, dirt bikes and go-karts and bulldozers and like whatever else around. Like, it was just this big complex where his kids get to grow up and they have a great time with all of this stuff. And then he builds it out into a music venue where I think that was the first guitar-shaped pool. I think is like, that's something that Chuck Berry gets credit for, is the pool at this music venue is the shape of a guitar. And they're having festivals there. It gets to be a pretty big deal here until one festival goes off the rails when, I can't remember the art. I'm kicking myself for not writing this down. But one of the headlining artists for this festival that Chuck Berry is putting on, there was some miscommunication between the event promoters and the artist. And basically, and this is also during the same kind of window of time. I don't know who thought this was, like, why this was so common. But like we talked about in our Graham Parsons episode, the catastrophe of a music festival that the Rolling Stones put on at the Sonoma Raceway. The reason that was a problem is because the Hells Angels were paid to be security. And when I was talking about Graham Parsons, like, how that Graham Parsons was kind of like the only act with the Flying Burrito Brothers that sort of seemed normal, and the rest of it was just chaos and people fighting and the Hells Angels in there. And, like, obviously, people get killed, and one guy in particular gets stabbed. And anyway, so that's the kind of thing that keeps happening around the Hells Angels and everything else. Well, the same thing happens. I mean, nobody dies, but some biker gang was paid to be security at Chuck Berry's place. And then this, I can't remember the name of the artist, but flies in on a helicopter, lands the helicopter, demands payment that wasn't available at the time, I guess. I don't know, whatever miscommunication happens between that artist and the promoter goes sideways. Guy gets back on his helicopter and leaves. And so now they have to tell this gigantic crowd of people, sorry guys, show's over. And that, like I said, angry crowd, biker gang security, things get wild and out of hand really fast. And so to the point where after that's all over, Chuck decides, we're not doing that anymore. Like, no more public events. He shuts it all down. That's just his property with his family and stuff. And there's it dilapidated is not the right word, but it quickly falls into disrepair. Like, Chuck just decided he'd had enough of that and just kind of stopped putting in the work necessary to keep a property like that in tip-top shape. So it kind of falls. It's kind of sad. In years following, you look at the footage of that place, and it's all, the buildings are all falling down, and it's just a bunch of cars just like in garages that are falling down on top of them, and cars and vehicles just like out in fields and stuff. And Chuck was just kind of over it. And but anyway, so that kind of marks his retirement, sort of. I mean, he's still out and like playing and doing stuff, but he never reaches the same height again. And but he's still a huge part of the music scene. And so, like, this is where like the Back to the Future movie kind of, like, that's a whole nother thing that people have mixed opinions on, because on the one hand, it's a reflection of how much Chuck Berry was part of the culture. And on the other hand, the way the Back to the Future handles that is a little bit wonky, because they kind of steal the credit from Chuck Berry for writing Johnny B. Goode. Like, you know, and it's some people like the least charitable way to look at that is like in the movie they made a white kid write Johnny B. Goode, and they kind of take the like they sort of whitewash that part of history. And what's funny is that there's actually something about like the guitar that they're using in the movie wasn't even invented in 1953. I think it was like that guitar was made in 1958 or something, and the amp he was using is wrong. Anyway, people really dig in on the details of how Back to the Future got this part wrong. But anyway, so they imply that Johnny B. Goode's written by this white kid, and that it's, you know, now it's okay for it to be popular. But anyway, the more charitable way to look at that is that's how much of a cultural icon this music was, that they put it in this movie aimed at the young demographic. And it is a nod to Chuck Berry and his music. And I'm sure, you know, Johnny B. Goode gets another boost in popularity after that movie. To be fair, that's where I first heard the song is, you know, when I'm a little kid and I hear Johnny B. Goode, I'm like, oh, that's a song from Back to the Future. Like, that's, in my head, that's the first place I heard it. But anyway, like I said, people have mixed opinions about that deal. But he continues working. So let's see here, 1984, he gets a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. And then in 1986, he's inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And actually, so it's the first class, like the inaugural class of Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Chuck Berry's in there, rightly so. And let's see here. And then after this, you just get kind of a lot of, you know, he slips into the phase of his career where he's this legend that is still around and is making appearances and stuff. But most of the cultural talk has shifted from he's the hottest thing around to appreciating his impact on music. So he's kind of this living legend character. And Keith Richards sticks with him and is very, you know, like they're friends, and, you know, he like Keith Richards puts on his 60th birthday, like he does a concert in St. Louis. And that was a crazy one because like Eric Clapton played and like, you know, a couple other people, but so let's see here. He has a couple more lawsuits and stuff through the years here, but we're into the tail end of the story here for the most part. Because let's see here. Yeah, he gets a bunch of other awards, and, you know, there's let's see. 20. Oh, so between 1996 and 2014, he kind of has a residency at Blueberry Hill, which is a restaurant in St. Louis. And he stays on and that's a long window of time. So almost, you know, 18 years he's doing this monthly show in St. Louis. And so he's staying on the local scene, keeps working. His health starts to deteriorate, though, to the point where people that do go to his shows are pretty disappointed towards the later, you know, span of time here, because he had rightfully so, because he's one of the greats, but he had a real chip on his shoulder, and he liked to embarrass other guitar players and artists that were on stage with him. So he would do this goofy stuff about like there's it might have been that 60th birthday concert, actually, maybe not, but anyway, but there will be these events where he's on stage with like a bunch of other top tier guitar players, and he would do things playing his own song. He would change the key and not tell anybody. And then so it's like there's 7 guys on stage playing guitar. Chuck Berry is one of them. They're all playing his song. He changes the key mid-song, so all of a sudden all these other guys are looking at each other like, what key are we? Like, what did he do? And so now they're all clamoring, trying to get back on board with Chuck Berry. But he doesn't give them the chance. He like changes the key, confuses the heck out of everybody, mumbles the last few words of the song, and walks off stage. So he leaves all these top tier dudes looking stupid, and it wasn't like a funny jab. They don't look back on that, you know, kindly, like, oh, that was Chuck, he was just playing a joke. It wasn't like we talked about, like when George Jones went on and played Buck Owens' set as like a jab. They laugh about that later. That was not happening here. This was like one of, I can't remember which guitar player it was, but it was like that was not a good experience. I did not like that. And he was like disappointed because he's like, that's one of my heroes. And he went up there and on purpose made me look like an idiot and then bounced and was like rude to everybody. But, so that kind of stuff starts to happen. And, actually on the subject of the George Jones thing, the argument about who's going to open and who's going to close, Chuck Berry had a similar argument with Jerry Lee Lewis because they were on tour together for a while. And, but when Jerry Lee Lewis does it, that's where, I think I covered it in the Jerry Lee Lewis episode. Same arguments happening. Who's going to open, who's going to close. Jerry Lee goes on first, knocks out the crowd, but then he takes a Coca-Cola bottle full of gasoline, pours it over the top of the piano, lights it on fire, which apparently didn't stop the show somehow. That wasn't like a clear the building thing. It was just like, oh, what a show. It was just extra pyrotechnics, I guess. I don't know. Because Chuck goes on and plays his show after, and everything goes as scheduled. But it was Jerry Lee trying to make the same point that George Jones had been making. So like this battle of the egos is firing on all cylinders for all these people. And but anyway, so Chuck is very particular, and he's willing to be mean about it. Like I said, in that context, when you go back and look at him giving Keith Richards all that hell about not playing this certain guitar lick exactly the right way, it was more about Chuck asserting dominance over the artists around him. He did not want to become the old guy or the old dog that everybody is surpassing. He wanted to maintain his grip on that top spot as long as he could. And, but his body kind of fails him here in the later years, and he starts doing stuff like that kind of on accident, where he's turning to his bandmates going, what key do we do this in? And they're like, E flat. And he goes, where is that? And he looks at his guitar neck, he forgot what position on the guitar neck to play. And then he'd get up there and forget words and just mumble stuff or make up new stuff or so his quality of show starts to take a real dive here. But, like I said, that we're just, we're coming into the later years of his life here. So, it doesn't take away from his status as a legend at this point. He's already done it and he's already achieved the success. He's just hanging on for a little longer than, his ability to play actually held in. And, but then in, let's see here, 2016, for his 90th birthday, they announced that they're making another record, and, which goes pretty well. I mean, he does succeed in making this record, but, in 2017, Chuck Berry dies, and he had a cardiac arrest at age 90. So and he's just found in his bed, goes to bed one day, doesn't wake up, and but the work on the album was done, so that gets released posthumously, and it kind of has a similar effect where we talked about Janis Joplin and Hank Williams and Patsy Cline and a couple of these other people. When these working musicians die, they have work that comes out after, and that kind of boosts the success of that album or song or whatever. And this has a similar effect, not quite to the same. It doesn't go to number one or anything, but it does. It achieves some extra success because of its proximity to his death. And yeah. So. Let's see here. And that record was released by Dual Tone Records. But yeah, so that's kind of his final send-off album there was, right after he died. And but yeah, just a legend that kind of came in, made his mark on music, made it last as long as he possibly could. So when I look at the Chuck Berry story, I feel those conflicted feelings. I cut, and maybe this is a reflection on me, but I did not cut Jerry Lee Lewis slack at all. To me, that the Jerry Lee Lewis episode, it's tough to get behind that guy, and it's tough to be to acknowledge him as one of the greats. when he's got all this other stuff going on in the background. Where for whatever reason, I feel less of that with Chuck Berry. Like, I feel less inclined to just put the screws to him about all of his, legal troubles in the past. But they're kind of the same guy. And that's, the justice system did not apply itself equally to those two characters or to Elvis or, any of these other guys. Like, so both things are true. The legal system had it out for Chuck Berry, and he got just unlucky break after unlucky break with the system just purposefully trying to drag him down for racial reasons. That's true. It is also true that he is equally tough to get behind as characters like Jerry Lee Lewis, who, like, it's the same problem. And but at the same time, you got to acknowledge they put their stamp on music, and those things did happen, but the art is there, and it's undeniable. Yeah. But that being said, like, you can't come away with it like, oh, we should get rid of the Mann Act. No, we used it 2 weeks ago to put away one of the most prolific pedophiles in America. So, like, it's got its uses and its purpose. It was just misapplied, or at least unequally applied back in the 50s and 60s. So it's just an interesting kind of snapshot of American culture at the time. And, it's an interesting commentary on the public's ability to look past problems for the sake of art. And, and even now, I don't exactly know how I feel about that. But tell you what, when you listen to Chuck Berry's music, your feet move involuntarily. You start bouncing around, and it's great music. So that is the definition of leaving a mark on the music of America. So that's Chuck Berry. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next week.